Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, college football edition, national championship on the horizon as Michigan will take on the Washington Huskies. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed college football co-hosts and colleagues, Brad Powers and Payne Insider. And gentlemen, we are finally upon the last college football game of the season. The hard work that was started around these parts with previews way back in May comes to an end, and it should be one hell of a game.
Yeah, it should be on paper. At least we got a different type of matchup here. I think, generally speaking, having Michigan and Washington in this game probably gives a little bit of hope to maybe 10 other programs that, hey, if Michigan and Washington can win a national championship, maybe we can. That hasn't been the case for the last 10, 15 years where only 4 or 5 programs have thought they could win it. So, yay, positive in that regard.
It feels like that was a possibility from the onset as we think back, right? We continued to iterate throughout the course of the season. Bama's down. Ohio State's down. Georgia is down relative to what they were, and it felt a little more wide open this season, and 2 teams have kind of finagled their way into this, and the really interesting part about this game, totally contrasting styles.
I think that's what makes it most intriguing. We can talk about the geographic footprint and how there's no Clemson hailing from, the South or the ACC, no SEC team, which is an extremely rare occurrence since we've gone to this particular format. But the way that both of these teams want to go about taking care of their business, Michigan looking to run the football and impose their will physically, defensively, and Washington with some elite wide receivers that if it's up to them, they'll look to air it out early and often with an offensive-minded head coach. But guys, before we get into the game itself, and we'll deep dive both sides of the ball as we so often do around these parts, it makes sense to kind of recap what we saw in the semifinals, and that, of course, in the nightcap and the Sugar Bowls, the Washington Huskies getting by Texas despite their best efforts to squander a late lead with poor clock management to the tune of 37-31. Michael Penix finishes that game with 430 passing yards, the 4th most in a game in college football playoff history. When you look at Washington, they beat Texas a year ago in the Alamo Bowl and follow it up with the victory in typical Washington fashion. Their 10th straight win this season by 10 points or less. Meanwhile, in the granddaddy of them all, in the Rose Bowl, it's Michigan needing overtime to get through Alabama 27-20, a game that was tied up with about a minute and a half to go. J.J. McCarthy leads that game-tying drive. Alabama isn't able to do anything with their final offensive series, becoming just the 3rd overtime game in college football playoff history, the first time since Alabama defeated Georgia in the 2017 national title game, and the 7-point fourth quarter comeback in the Rose Bowl versus Alabama matched the largest that Michigan had accomplished under Coach Harbaugh since 2015. So, Brad, we'll start with you. Anything that really stood out in terms of surprises or disappointments for the 2 semifinal games that were must-see TV on New Year's Day?
I'll say, first and foremost, the 2 right teams won. As far as you dive into the box scores, looking at the stats, but the teams that deserved to win the game won the game. I mean, Michigan, obviously, at the start of the game against Alabama, dominated the game. It certainly should have been up a hell of a lot more than 3 points at halftime. But special teams miscues, tough to forecast that one. Michigan was pretty solid in special teams all season long. Almost did them in, almost cost them the game. Even obviously almost fumbling a punt in the final minute inside your own 5.
Brad, what the hell is the kid doing back there to even field the punt? Like, how is Jay Harbaugh even allowing that to happen? Going, if it's anywhere inside the 10, plant your heels and just let the ball go over the head, regardless of what side people had in that particular game.
It's an epidemic in football. I mean, we used to, when we were growing up, I mean, we're talking multiple decades. That was the rule. Stand at the 10, and just if it goes past you, it goes past you. You don't even try to field it. Michigan's not the only one that's fielding punts now inside their own 10. I see it on a weekly basis. Time and place for everything, though. That was not the time or the place to let that ball fall wherever it falls. But my goodness, Michigan special teams almost costing them there. But I thought maybe most surprising, not that Michigan won the line of scrimmage. I think you could kind of see that coming a little bit with the struggles of Alabama's offensive line. We were probably the only podcast previewing the game that talked about Alabama center issues. I'm not sure that you found that being mentioned too often. That was obviously a big issue. I thought Michigan's really outcoached Alabama significantly. And that was, at least as a guy that leaned more on the Alabama side, that was surprising to me, because what I had seen is anytime you give Saban and company extra time to prep, usually they outperformed expectations. You give Harbaugh extra time to prep, team's a little tight for whatever reason. I still thought Michigan was a little tight. No further proof than McCarthy, trying to throw his best effort to throw a pick on the first play of the game. But when it came down to it, as the game progressed, I mean, I thought Michigan outcoached Alabama, and not every single possession, but man, there was some possessions there where Alabama was completely lost on both sides of the ball. Guys running wide open, multiple guys running wide open on certain plays, and then obviously defensively, I mean, Alabama's offensive line totally confused as far as protection.
It was the Achilles heel that we had talked about for great stretches. We had seen market improvement from Alabama, but there were a little bit in the way of signs that said, all right, everything isn't exactly going to be fixed. No greater illustration than the Alabama center after that game entering the transfer portal. Can't imagine having to stare down Nick Saban in the film room after or in the spring was going to be an optimal situation. But, Payne, when you look at that game in terms of the way things played out, I mean, Brad talked about coming in with the expectation, I think that we all had, that Alabama was going to be able to make the adjustments. And when you look at their game plan in the third quarter, when they're able to flip field position, you get the feeling that Michigan's not going to be able to get out of their own way, couldn't get a first down to try and create a little bit of separation. And then it wasn't until that drive where they absolutely needed to put points on the board that you saw Sharon Moore and company get back to what had worked so well in the first half in terms of getting J.J. McCarthy under center, operating off of play action, and not diagnosing and telegraphing every single offensive play call to allow that Alabama pass rush to pin their ears back and come after him.
I think you guys both summed up the game perfectly there. And I'm glad we were kind of all on the same page, because I know we had some, differing views coming into the game, and there was differing views throughout the market. And, there was some sharp money on both sides of that game, a little bit of a battle. But I thought Michigan could have put the game away early, because they were dominating down to down. And I think all of the talk and the narrative was Nick Saban and his staff having the coaching edge leading up, and the game just didn't start that way. So I gave some kudos to Harbaugh and Minter and Sharon. They just seemed to make better use of their month off and had the better initial game plan. And as we're watching this, ESPN flashes the graphic with under 5 minutes to go in the second quarter. Michigan's outgaining Alabama 199 yards to 39. If you just used something extremely surface level like yards per point based on each team's season-long average, the score at that point should have been Michigan 19, Alabama 3. But the scoreboard's 13-7, and a few minutes later it's 13-10 heading into the break, and I wasn't feeling great. And all of a sudden you see the market open, Michigan won at the break, and Alabama's getting the ball first. Number. It's a strong second-half number, right? It's effectively Michigan 4, and Alabama's getting the ball to start the second half. So felt pretty good seeing that. Clearly, Alabama was fortunate not to be down 2 scores at the break, but the obvious, right? Special teams played a massive role in the game. Michigan, to Brad's point, had been pretty efficient throughout the year with their special teams. The bright lights, right? The Rose Bowl, you have a true freshman returning punts. That was a disaster. And then late game, you mentioned it, they changed out the punt returner. He was a disaster. Also, Alabama's punter was dominant. So I looked at net special teams EPA for the game. Alabama was a net positive 15.4 EPA on special teams. And it's not just the obvious stuff of the muffed punt that turned into points or a bad snap on the extra point. The third quarter, where Alabama gained their true momentum, it was field position based on 2 punters. Bama's punter, you have James Burnip. He was fantastic. Michigan's punter, Tommy Doman, wasn't great. And so Michigan's first 3 possessions of the second half started at their own 13, their own 11, in their 25-yard line. And you talk to any offensive coordinator, the play sheet shrinks when you're backed up in your own end. So to your point, Michigan went uber conservative. At the same time, Nick Saban made those halftime adjustments, and Alabama started putting a fifth defensive lineman on the field and cheated their safety down. And so you get that conservative Michigan play calling with that Nick Saban adjustment, and it leads to 23 yards in the third quarter. And suddenly you're like, oh my God, this great Michigan bet is going to go awry. And you just kind of see how the game starts, how slanted the special teams were. And I know I sent out a tweet, and there's a couple responses. Special teams is a third of the game. It's not. It accounts for about 17% of a college football game. It was just weighted through the moon for this specific game. But where I'm going with this is Michigan not putting the game away early, right? Having just blunder after blunder on special teams almost negated the fact that their game plan defensively was nails. And as we talked that game out last week, I kind of changed my mind hearing Brad. I was like, I thought my side of the ball was the important side. Then I heard Brad. I was like, man, I think it's maybe his side. And so all of those early stunts and the timely pressure got to Jalen Milroe. They stole Kirby Smart's game plan and improved upon it, forcing Milroe to throw to areas of the field he wasn't comfortable with. They made Milroe read defenses and pat the ball, and Michigan had 12 pressures in the game. Those pressures turned into sacks 58% of the time. The downfall was you didn't get out early. And had they got out early, that would have been the entire game. But because it was so close, all of a sudden Alabama goes into halftime, and it just becomes a run game the rest of the way. They're not making Jalen Milroe sit back and dissect as a pocket passer. So I thought the game plan initially from Tommy Rees was pretty poor. Fortunately, he had time to change it because Michigan didn't take advantage early.
I mean, I think Brad used the perfect word, saying Michigan was tight, and Alabama gets that 7-0 lead. You're sitting there going, all right, we've seen this story before for Michigan in the college football playoff. Is it going to be history repeating itself for the third straight year? When you were blasted by Georgia the first time you got in, you were outcoached to some level against TCU because the defense wasn't able to get off the field, but it was the defense that became their saving grace, allowing Michigan to shift a little bit of that momentum, take a 13-10 lead into the half, and find a way late in that contest to force overtime before the big Blake Corum run, and then, of course, the goal line stand from the Wolverines that punched their ticket to NRG Stadium for the national championship. In the night game, when you look at the way that contest played out, I mean, Washington came out with some haymakers early on in that contest, looked for all intents and purposes in the second half like they were going to run away and hide, and for whatever reason, this Washington team over the last 2+ months has really had difficulty finding that separation late and being able to close out contests. No greater illustration than when they had the opportunity to go up by multiple scores, you're unable to punch in for 7. Michael Penix, despite all the college football he's played and that veteran leadership, rather than sliding down to keep that clock going on third down before Washington takes a field goal, you leave the door open even a crack. Texas comes through. The unfortunate injury to Dylan Johnson, and the rest is history with those 3 plays that didn't quite materialize for Texas. But you look at the Longhorns in that game, guys, 28 carries the team, 180 yards. You didn't have more than 9 carries from any of their running backs. CJ Baxter and Jaden Blue shared the workload, but both were ultra efficient in that regard. But when we look at the way things went there, Brad, it almost felt like we've seen this story from Texas before. The defense gets all the headlines because the NFL caliber talent along the defensive line, but they can't make a disruptive play. And an offense that checks every box in terms of 4- and 5-star recruits and elite playmakers bogs down for stretches, and it became their undoing because they couldn't hit a big, timely play when they needed it most to force Washington to play from behind the 8 ball.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, Washington dictated the tempo right out of the bat by you mentioned it, hitting a couple haymakers and playing with the lead early in that game. Kind of forced Texas's hand where they couldn't overly rely on the ground game like I'm sure that they wanted to do. Quinn Ewers, yeah, the overall counting stats as far as passing yardage, it looks good, but I mean, he was very uneven to say the least. He even in the fourth quarter missed some throws, or at least had some questionable decisions. So I thought, again, typical of the, similar to the Alabama-Michigan game where Washington, game plan wise, had a better game plan to start off the game. And adjustments obviously were made from Texas playing from behind there. They went a little bit more pass happy in the fourth quarter and had some success in that regard. Washington, you mentioned, the team, the inability to put, step on the throat of their opponents. Well, I think a lot of it has to do with inability to have a consistent ground game. Dylan Johnson, certainly, they found it a little bit in certain games, particularly the USC game with them running the ball. But the best way to step on somebody's throat is the ability to run down their throat, especially to eat clock, and they just don't have that consistency in the run game to do that. So, but we'll see how much it gets better in this game, and we'll get to that in a second. But overall, I thought Penix was as good as it gets, especially throwing it down the field. He looks healthy. Yeah, it's starting to become more and more obvious. He wasn't healthy for long stretches down the stretch of the regular season. McMillan is another cog that, I've mentioned this in some other shows that I've done. You add him to the mix, it's like a 1 + 1 + 1 = 4 situation when you have 3 dynamic wide receivers instead of just 2, and most teams do not have the ability to cover 3 dynamic wide receivers. So he makes a difference. Washington, very well coached. What can we say? For Kalen DeBoer to get this team playing for a national championship, impressed with Washington. They were the right side and deserved to win the game outright.
Crazy part about that, Brad, you mentioned Washington's inability to step on the throat. They did such a great job that entire third quarter of suffocating Texas' offense. The Longhorns only ran 5 offensive plays. Now, I know Washington forced a turnover, would change that dynamic a little bit, but you figured, all right, that was going to be the perfect quarter for Washington. They could carry that momentum forward, and never watching that football game in the second half did I think Texas was going to have a chance from inside the 20-yard line for a game-winning touchdown, trailing by just 1 score. But, Payne, when you watched that game, what were some of the biggest takeaways you had? Was it disappointing from Texas? Did you feel like Washington went out there and executed to the best of their abilities? What was the lasting thing for you after you watched 4 quarters down there in New Orleans?
Thought the game was straightforward. Kalen DeBoer and Chuck Morrill had the better game plans, and Washington executed better early. We identified the massive edge. It wasn't difficult if you truly do this at a high level, right? The edge was through the air for Washington against that Longhorn secondary that we just felt was not very good, right? It's basically one guy who's above average in Watts, and that's it. And sure enough, you look at Michael Penix to average more than 11 yards per drop back, 54% passing success rate, 10% explosive pass rate. And defensively, Chuck Morrill knew his man. Guessed right on the Sark script. And Texas is recruiting at a level now where it can kind of help some of the coaching issues Sark has. And I'll be candid, you guys pushed me across the line. I'm thankful for it on the over Texas wins in the Big 12 conference. I thought the Big 12 was down just a touch this year, but we saw in the big game what it was. Sark came out, and I know they're down 7-0. It's a long freaking game, man. Get the ground game going. And it wasn't. It was the Quinn Ewers pass game. And Chuck Morrill guessed right on the script. And he knew Sark was going to come out and be overly aggressive, far too pass happy early, and Quinn Ewers wasn't accurate. That was the Quinn Ewers that I had questions about all season. And at that point, once Washington built the lead with their throw game and some timely stops, it was just about holding on. And I think you actually hit it perfectly. It's like, boy, as much as we respect Kalen DeBoer and love Michael Penix, those two gentlemen, whoa, Nelly. They tried giving that game away late. Penix 3rd and goal from the Texas 10 with 2:44 to play. Can't throw the ball away when nobody's open. Fall to the ground, force the clock to keep running, force Texas to burn a timeout. One of those two options. Gave away a free stop there. And then the final Washington possession trying to end the game, like, what the fuck are you doing? Right? Put Penix back in the shotgun. Have him take the snap, have him ease his way backwards a few yards, and then take a knee before defenders crash. Like, that not only burns more clock, but the chances of a fumble decrease because your running back isn't running his head into a brick wall, and at the same time, your running back isn't getting carted off the field days before the biggest freaking game of the season. So it was an absolute disaster end game for DeBoer and Penix. It almost cost him. If Quinn Ewers was a better quarterback, it would have. We saw that you were struggling early, inaccurate, and then all of a sudden the decision-making late. How does only one of 4 passes make it to the end zone on the final drive?
What is the screen pass? What are we doing if you're Texas? If the running back falls down there, that's the last play of the game, and it accomplished nothing.
No. And even the last pass. And I was driving in the car to get a haircut, and I heard Joel Klatt say something, and it was so spot on. Quinn Ewers doesn't know what pass to make in certain situations. We just think a quarterback's accurate, right? It's all kind of like a mindset of a pitcher, like what pitch are you throwing? And he threw the wrong pitch, so to speak, on the last play to Adonai Mitchell, who was wide open if he throws the right pass. But he tries like feathering it in, even though he's got inside position. That's one that needs to be on time and a little bit faster. And it's just a feathered in ball there. And so the one pass that actually does make it to the end zone is horrifically thrown. And so that was the culmination of that game for me. And I think we'll break these teams down a little bit here in the national championship game. But overall takeaway there is Washington's offense healthy. Washington's defense a little bit healthier as well.
Look, I mean, you mentioned knowing what pitch to throw. There's a reason Yankee fans got spoiled watching Mariano Rivera. He threw one pitch. He threw it better than anybody with the cut fastball. Quinn Ewers trying to go through the arsenal. Did not choose correctly. And Texas will go back to the drawing board with a much more difficult road to get to the college football playoff, even in an expanded format with the schedule they will encounter in their first season in the SEC. You can follow Brad on Twitter at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. And most importantly, for all things Bet the Board, be sure to follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And gentlemen, as we look at the national championship game, you look around the market, Michigan anywhere from as low as a 4.5-point favorite, upwards of 5.5. The total pretty much painted across the board. At a 56.5, there are still some 55.5s that are juiced, some numbers in between. And I found some of the information out there interesting. You know, a couple of writers at The Athletic, Bruce Feldman and David Ubben, did an outstanding job talking to opposing coaches. And one quote that stuck with me, and I'll read it directly. "This is probably the first time I've ever been fired up for a national championship game," said one coordinator who faced Washington earlier this year. "I'm so fascinated with this game because they're like two polar opposites going up against each other. And for the first time since 2020 season, both teams will enter the college football national championship game undefeated. The winner will become the fourth major program since 1900 to finish with 15 wins in a season. It'll be the first time since 2014 that the SEC will not be in the college football title game. When you look at the SEC, they had won previous 4 titles and 6 of the last 9 overall. Third appearance for the Big Ten in the title game, second for the Pac-12, first for the Pac-12 since Oregon got there way back in 2014. And the 1 and 2 seeds are meeting in the college football playoff title game for the first time since 2018 and 4th time overall. For those folks who like to look ahead to the 2024 season, you may as well circle October 5th on your calendars. Regardless of who has revenge, Michigan will make the trip out west to Seattle for a Big Ten conference game to take on the Huskies. And when we look at Washington's path to get here, guys, they've now won 21 straight games, 25 straight wins under Kalen DeBoer when Washington has held their opponents below 40 points. Won back-to-back games versus AP top 5 teams for the first time since the early 90s as a program. As we mentioned at the top, they've also won 10 straight games by 10 or fewer points. The longest streak of wins all coming by 10 or less points in D1 history going back to 1973. Kalen DeBoer, no stranger to winning national championships. Of course, not at this level. He won 4 straight at the NAIA level with Sioux Falls from 2006 to 2009. Michigan, they've led at halftime in all 14 games so far this season. It's their first appearance in a national championship game as a program seeking their 10th title in school history and the first since 1997 when they split with Nebraska. But this is a group that's got some injury concerns on the defensive side. We look at Washington. They have some concerns offensively with Dylan Johnson's status. So, Brad, when we begin to look at this Michigan offense, though, against the Washington defense, Michigan, 36 points per game, 30-plus points in 11 of 14 contests. They've been great when it comes to ball security, but they've lacked the explosive play. Just 19 plays of longer than 30 yards this season, which ranks 112th nationally. We talk about big play potential in college football and being able to pick up chunk yardage in 2023. They don't have that, but it hasn't slowed them down. When you look at Michigan's offense, we can talk about running the football and stay committed to the ground game. What does their path to success look like against this Huskies defense?
Well, I think it starts with the run game because obviously not that Michigan's run game has been overly dominant. In fact, it hasn't been this year. It's been taken a couple notches backwards compared to what it was last year. A lot of it has to do with the inability to create big plays in the run game. Corum, and we've mentioned this several podcasts, Corum and Donovan Edwards just not as explosive as what they were a year ago. Offensive line that had won the Joe Moore Award back-to-back years, a little bit of a step back, and then obviously losing arguably your top offensive lineman in the Ohio State game that didn't help them, and you had a couple of tackles that were less than 100% down the stretch of the season. With that being said, even with Michigan's run game not being as good as what it was the previous 2 years, there is the advantage on their side of the ball here against a Washington defense that, if we're looking at, and comparing to previous national championship teams that have either won it or at least appeared in the national championship game, it's historically underwhelming unit, to say the least. Just, basic counting stats. You're talking about a Washington defense that's number 68 in yards per play, number 97 yards per game allowed. They do an okay job of keeping the scoring down, but they're still number 53 in the country in that regard. If you start looking at a little bit more of the advanced metrics, Bill Connolly does a pretty decent job as far as power ratings and coming up with the schedule adjusted offensive and defensive ratings. He has Washington's defense number 44, so actually giving them credit a little bit more than the basic counting stats when you factor in their schedule. But 44th, where would that rank as far as national champs? It'd be the last national champ to rank outside the top 30 in his defensive rankings, Oklahoma, in 1950. So this is not a Washington defense that we're going to remember from a historic aspect. Now, Payne did mention some key factor that I think is making it very tough, not only for Washington's defense, but obviously on the offense side of the ball, the lack of health down the stretch for them on both sides makes it tough to come up with a very solid power rating on Washington and just how good they can be. Or is this a team that struggled in a multitude of games regardless of competition level? The game plan for Michigan has to be, let's just test Washington and their manhood from the get-go. That would be my game plan. Let's just see if they can hold up at the point of attack. If I'm Washington, I do have a couple of areas where I feel okay. I think I'm not sure that Michigan's wide receiver room is going to scare me. If I'm Washington, I feel good about my cornerbacks. At least on tape, they've shown out. I think there's an ability for Washington to creep a couple of guys extra into the box, and let's just see who can win the battle from the get-go in that regard. But Michigan's offense struggled down the stretch, but I think it had more to do with a little bit of lack of health and also a lot to do with they were playing really good defenses in Penn State and Ohio State. Washington is not in the same neighborhood as even in Iowa, obviously. I think the edge here is Michigan's offense against Washington's defense. The question is, how big of an edge is it going to be? I think that's the answer to that question is whether or not you like Michigan laying the points here.
Brad, you mentioned some of the disparity, and when you look at the counting stats for Washington, there's no way to sugarcoat what some of those numbers look like. But at 120th in the country in total pass defense, what I find fascinating is they're still 22nd in the country in yards per pass attempt allowed, which actually ranks them better from that particular metric than a team like Penn State that we know has NFL caliber corners and always gets a ton of accolades. The issue for Washington is how they've been against the run, 86 in the FBS in terms of yards per carry. So if Michigan is patient, there should be a path to success. And I think that was one of the other interesting comments in the article I referenced in The Athletic, where opposing coaches said Texas just grew impatient, to highlight your point, Payne, where they didn't stay committed to the ground game, willing to wear down Washington. It was almost as though they got themselves down early, felt they needed to panic, and went away from one of their particular strengths. Clearly, if Michigan plays from a positive game state here, it opens up the entire playbook, play action. Brad referenced some of the receivers that we have questions about operating on an island against a Washington secondary that's not elite by any stretch of the imagination, but you do have a couple players in Dominic Hampton and Jabbar Muhammad who can make life a little bit more difficult. So, Payne, when you look at this side of the ball, is there something that stands out that you want to watch and see unfold, whether it's J.J. McCarthy using a passing game to open up what Michigan wants to do on the ground, or ways that we can see Chuck Morrill and William Inge come up with a defensive game plan that allows Michigan or prevents Michigan from getting to their strength too early in this game?
Yeah, I think this side of the ball is very straightforward. And, Brad did mention about the Huskies' health, and much of that is on the defensive side of the ball. They've been much healthier than during that 5 or 6 game lull where we just completely wrote Washington off at that point. And I think that's the intriguing part about this game. And Washington has a chance to prove us all wrong, right? Prove all the recruiting services wrong. In a regular college football season, and this again is far from one of those, it's very difficult to win a championship with this kind of quality Washington has along their defensive line. And I think from the onset, Michigan's game plan is ABC 1, 2, 3. It's meat and potatoes. It's slow pace. It's methodical. It's keep the ball away from Penix and those receivers. And they're going to trot out their heavy packages and try and play bully ball. The positive for Michigan is that's not a change up from what they do. I kind of equate this and think to things in an NFL manner, right? We talk about, a couple years ago, all these teams, when they would play Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs, hey, we're going to grind this game out. We're going to get the ground game going, But sometimes that style doesn't behoove the offense to do that. Well, this is exactly what Michigan does, right? It's their identity. And you look at Michigan, they run the ball in 62% of neutral situations. Michigan has no problems running it against a stacked box either. If you remove all of the option teams from the equation, Michigan ran into a stacked box at the 5th highest rate in the country. And so, yes, the offensive line has downgraded a little bit year over year. It loses a key cog in the Ohio State game. The running backs aren't as explosive, but they're also facing more stacked boxes this season, over 71% of the time. So, it's very possible that Michigan lives in standard downs all night, 2nd and 6, 2nd and 5, right? 3rd and 2, 3rd and 1. I would think Washington will have its linebackers playing downhill. The safeties are going to have to crash down into the box, play there more frequently. And at that point, Sharon Moore has to fire up the play action game, right? Yep. Get the tight ends involved, get Loveland going. If somehow Michigan is trailing or Washington comes up with a game plan and exceeds expectations stopping the run, you do wonder what that means for J.J. McCarthy and Michigan's throw game. I have been down on that aspect of Michigan more than I think market. And the minute we saw J.J. McCarthy throw the pick that was overturned early in the Bama game, you kind of saw Sharon Moore put kid gloves on McCarthy. 6-yard ADOT. 71% of throws were 9 yards or shorter. Only 1 of 27 pass attempts for J.J. traveled 20-plus yards. And I think this Husky secondary, which you kind of mentioned there, Todd, is much better than people give it credit for. Jabbar Muhammad is going to be an NFL player. He is. I just think that unit's better than advertised. They can make plays on the ball. Top 30 in ball hawk rate. The positive, though, I think, if Michigan has to throw it a touch more than we expect, because either Washington gets out early or the run game is, isn't going as well, or Washington's completely loading the box to where it's giving Michigan looks to throw it a little bit more, Washington's outside the top 100 in pressure rate generated. That's a stark difference from going against Turner and Braswell and Bama defense last week. That was, top 10 in pressure rate. So I do still think, even if the Michigan ground game isn't as efficient as we might want it to be or think it could be, there's still some paths here, I think, for J.J. McCarthy in the throw game if the pressure isn't getting home.
I mean, look, Washington encounters very prolific passing games on a weekly basis or semi-regular basis in the Pac-12, but they're not used to encountering this level of physicality for teams that will make a concerted effort.
Or defending both.
Right.
Right? You still have to defend both, even if, Michigan isn't going for 8 yards a carry, right, and they're going for, 2 or 3 yards, and they're in heavy formation. Just the looks alone are going to force you at least to respect the run to where you can't just sit on pass like many weeks in the Pac-12.
Right, exactly. I mean, they're going to have to try and probably, to your point, commit an extra body to the box and go, look, we need to make Michigan one-dimensional. Which dimension do we at least want to try and take away, especially early on in the game? Because there's nothing Washington would love more than being able to build an early lead and put Michigan in a little bit more conflict than they've grown accustomed to, a team that's led at halftime in every single game they've played, which has negated some of the questions and concerns we have about Michigan throwing themselves back into a contest, which which made last week against Alabama, when they had to erase that late deficit, even that much more impressive. And if Washington's defense is going to have their jobs made easier, it's because their offense is found a little bit of success against Michigan's defense in this game. And when we look at the Huskies offensively, gentlemen, Washington second in the FBS with 39 passing plays that covered more than 30 yards this season. They run the ball less than 30 times per game. Only 6 FBS teams and just 2 from the Power 5 run it less often than the Huskies, and that job only gets to be that much more difficult if Dylan Johnson is at all limited. We saw against Texas, 21 carries, 49 yards. It wasn't what he was able to do in terms of hitting the big play, but he forced Texas to at least respect the ground game. Being hobbled in this spot, I'm not sure that's a luxury that's going to work in their favor. When we look at Washington from a passing standpoint, their group averages nearly 350 yards per game through the air. I mean, Coach Harbaugh's team has faced only 3 offenses with top 50 scoring averages so far this season, so it's not like Michigan has faced elite high-flying offenses. And Washington, when they've stepped up in class, has done exceptionally well. We can use the 2 Oregon games as data points when the Washington offense played what we would call a plus-plus defense. When we look at Michael Penix in those 3 games against top 20 scoring defenses, ends up with more than 1,000 yards passing and 7 touchdowns. And look, Penix has gone up against the Michigan defense. It's going to look a little bit different now than what it did when he was a member at Indiana. But to Brad's point, Michael Penix against Texas answered the call when called upon over and over and over again when you have some of those weapons in spades. So, Payne, I'll come to you first. When I look at this Washington offense, do you see a potential path for them to have success against a Michigan defense that got a ton of pressure without blitzing against the Alabama offensive line that left a lot to be desired, a much stiffer test against the Joe Moore Award winners, and a Washington front that has only allowed Michael Penix to get sacked 14 times so far this season?
Yeah, I think when you have a healthy Penix and a healthy receiver core, there's relative phrases in terms of stopping Washington, right? Like they're getting, their floor is so high, right? It's do they reach their ceiling? If they reach their ceiling, they're gonna upset Michigan. I think this is what makes this game really interesting. It's far and away the best defense that Washington's played all season. Far and away the best offense Michigan's played all season. And so there's some variance within that. You specifically mentioned Washington's offensive line. They have been fantastic in protection. They're light years better than what Michigan took advantage of with 30 days to prepare against Alabama, right? That was an Alabama offensive line that was somewhat improved down the stretch, but in the run game was 76th in creating yards before first contact, 105th in pressure rate allowed. You kind of couple that with Jalen Milroe, who pats the ball and holds on to it forever, and that's why he was sacked 5 times in the first half. It's the complete inverse here. The Huskies' offensive line, 8th in pressure rate allowed. You have the 2 tackles in Fontenot and Rosengarten. They've been elite at the tackle positions. DeBoer did a fantastic job scheme-wise helping the interior part of the line hold Sweat and Murphy to a 12% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. Now, I think Michigan has more depth along the D-line than Texas this year. And while there isn't like a star yet, Michigan, I think, has a better collection of edge guys than Texas. But I don't see Michigan with less time to prepare against a far better offensive line just dominating up front like it did early against Bama. I also think Michael Penix actually has a clock in his head, and he's willing to get rid of it quicker if he has to. We've seen that. He's also going to be, in a high-leverage game like this, willing to use his legs more. There was some designed run stuff with 30 days off against Texas. I think that the other scary part here is, Washington held up very well against that Texas front 7. That was the question mark. You play in the Pac-12, not a ton of great defensive lines out there. You got a very good defensive line. You stepped up in class and played fantastic. Michigan, to me, truly hasn't been tested. The best quarterbacks it's faced this season, if you can think about this.
Talia.
Kyle McCord. Well, maybe he'll get his 9th year if Miami pays.
He's trying to be a doctor, Payne. Don't stand in the ways of his hopes and dreams to be a trained member of the medical profession.
It's just so fitting that that's the case, and Miami's got a good medical school.
See, there you go.
So it's Kyle McCord, it's Drew Allar, it's Jalen Milroe. Think about how we've discussed those gentlemen at differing parts of
I think
the
Brad's
season,
sound
right?
effect told us all we needed to know.
Right. We never bought into Drew R. There hasn't been, I don't think, a podcast more dialed in on Jalen Milroe from being the best floor and ceiling guy for Alabama, but also where the best parts of his game is. And, Tommy Rees seemed to kind of move his pass game towards that a couple weeks after we talked about it. Kyle McCord, there's a reason he's at Syracuse now. And really in the one game, Ohio State goes into Michigan. Kyle McCord's competent enough, right, to hang 24 points. Marvin Harrison averages 24 yards a catch, goes for 118 a touchdown. McCord was 4 for 7 on deep throws, 20-plus yards. So it's really interesting to see. Like, we're in a time now, and maybe this changes in this specific game, right? Maybe it goes back to the 1950s cliche of defense wins championships. But we know now in 2023, 2024, like, offense equates to winning more than defense does. I love the tandem of Will Johnson and Josh Wallace. But Washington's a different animal with Rome, Polk, and McMillan. And I also think the crew officiating this game could impact things based upon style. Like, I'm too familiar with the worst officiated conference in the ACC. This specific crew is an ACC crew. It likes to call the game tight, especially outside. They've called the highest rate of pass interference in college football. And so when you got those three receivers, I think that maybe provides them like an underlying edge there potentially. Now, Dylan Johnson is a massive injury. I think we've talked about throwing to set up the run. And if you just look at like the yards per carry, it wasn't very good against Texas. But in short yardage, very good, right? Had the 2 short yardage rushing touchdowns, had the big 4th-and-1 conversion. In protection, he was huge. He helped some of those interior linemen pick up some pressures when Murphy and Sweat got through there. He's vital in the dump-off pass game. Would be a massive loss for Washington. He was obviously carted off, then got the boot and joined the team for the festivities, and they're saying he's going to play. It's just a quick turnaround game here. So, Dylan Johnson would be a massive loss if he's not healthy. My guess is maybe he tries to gut it out, but, I mean, how long does that last? So, this to me has some variance. Like, I don't think you're completely shutting down Washington. I just think the best defense Michigan may have for Washington is the other side of the ball that we just talked about is playing keep away, which is their style, which is their brand. It's their identity.
Look, it's exactly what Michigan wants to do. They want to put together long time consuming drives, force opposing offenses to get out of rhythm. But I think the point that you made talking about the caliber of offenses that Michigan has played this year leaves a lot to be desired. And we can even go one step further. You mentioned Ohio State and what they were able to do against the Michigan defense. Kyle McCord was rolled up the week before. We're not even sure how healthy he was in that game in terms of his lower body mechanics. And while Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to be playing on Sundays, there were a lot of pieces in that Ohio State receiving room that weren't at full speed that can rival what Washington wants to do. And Brad, when we look at this Huskies offense, we've talked so much about Michael Penix and what he means, the wealth of weapons he has at his disposal, the offensive line that gives him time in the pocket. I mean, against Texas, he had nearly 3 seconds on each of his dropbacks, despite Texas having 2 guys that are going to be first-round draft picks in Byron Murphy and Tavondre Sweat. When we look at Michigan defensively, where are some of the biggest questions that have to be answered for the Wolverines? I mean, do they manufacture pressure? Do they try and bring an extra guy and allow Penix to diagnose? Because the one thing we've seen with veterans on a stage like this that's going to be different than Jalen Milroe is Penix has seen everything. He's going to be able to assess things pre-snap. If Michigan wants to rotate defensive backs and try and confuse him, will it put Michigan at a point of conflict where Penix can go out there and hunt the deep ball, or is it something where he's got to be significantly more patient, knowing that Michigan has done an outstanding job suppressing explosives all year?
Yeah, I'm going to say that Michigan probably feels it out a little bit to see if they have the ability to get pressure with just their 4 down linemen. Now, no one's really been able to get consistent pressure on Washington all year, but this one I don't think is going to be as far as the basic, did Michigan get 3 or 4 sacks on Penix? No, I don't think it's going to be necessarily weighted in that regard. It's just, did they get enough pressure in his face to make him throw a half a second or a second quicker than what he wanted, to make him maneuver in the pocket a little bit bit more than what he wants to instead of just sitting back there. I think Michigan has that ability to piggyback off of what Payne said. Maybe they don't have the elite guys up front that Texas did, the top two guys, but they are deeper, and they can throw waves throughout the entire game of not only edge rushers, but guys even in the interior when you're talking about like a Mason Graham on the interior of the defense. So I think Michigan feels it out a little bit early to see if they can have success without having to put extra guys in the box. Because I think, like Payne mentioned, as good as Will Johnson, Josh Wallace, Sanders still is in the back end, you probably are going to try to help them out because great offense beats great defense in today's day and age of college football. And I'm not sure I'm putting them guys on islands to start off the game plan because I'm sure Washington, I'll try to test that early. To me, we talked about Michigan having different maybe possible pathways here. Most obvious one, them just controlling the clock and running right at Washington. I think the only pathway for Washington to win this game is Michael Penix having to play like he did against Texas, and maybe even needing to be even a little bit better as far as an entire full quarter, 60-minute effort. He's capable of it. That's the thing. If you're wanting to root for Washington in this game, that wide receiver core in Penix is capable of having a Herculean effort. I would make a case that if we're looking at maybe the most elite unit in college football this year, I don't think there's much. I think a lot of teams obviously have flaws, but maybe the Washington passing offense is that elite, historically great unit that puts them over the top. But they're going to need to play like that in order to win the game. And he's going to have the ability to throw it like he has a lot of the season, 40, 50 yards down the field, putting it in bread baskets, putting it in the small windows. If he does that, Washington has success. But I have doubts. When you remove the semblance of any type of balance, the balance being Dylan Johnson's ability to give you a different type of look, whether it's in protection, whether it's throwing a screen pass out to him, whether it's getting short yardage situations. You remove that from Washington's offense, my goodness. I mean, that's putting a hell of a lot of pressure. That's saying that Penix, you have to go out there and play the game of your life here for us to win. He's capable of it, but I just have my doubts.
We look back and you try and find data points where Penix struggled, and whether it was injury concerns, focus, or a variety of other things. The game that stands out to me, guys, a 15-7 win for Washington against Arizona State when Kenny Dillingham and company came up with a unique defensive game plan. It was the only contest this year where Penix threw more than one interception, and it was one of two games which he was held without a touchdown pass. The Huskies didn't have a passing play of more than 21 yards. That, of course, comes with a caveat. We're not sure how healthy Penix was, dealing with a bit of a flu bug. You didn't have Jalen McMillan, but it is some interesting food for thought. One final thing for me on this game, guys, when we look at some of the trends as far as championship games are concerned, limited sample size, but the favorite 4-0 ATS, the last four college football championship games after the underdog had rattled off 5 straight in the first 5 college football championships. The over in the last 8 college football championship games, 6-1-1. The over is actually 6-1 in college football championships in this format when the total is posted under 70, well in that range in the mid-50s, knowing that Michigan wants to run the football. And final word to you on this game, Brad, when you look at the number in terms of how the market has responded to Washington's surge, fair or foul with where the game is priced, knowing it was just 2 games ago that Washington found themselves a double-digit dog out here in Las Vegas in the Pac-12 championship against the Oregon Ducks.
Tough. I mean, a little bit foul. You have such a short season in college football as far as the data points. So every data point just means that much more in college football when you only have 12 of them in a regular season. It's very tough for my power ratings and some of the other more well-known power ratings that are out there in the market to appropriately price this Washington team when they had 6 below average. I mean, at least relatively speaking, for a team playing in the title game, 6 below average data points to close the regular season. It's tough, just disregarding that. Oh, they weren't healthy. Let's just throw all them away because, I mean, it was against a variety of competition, a lot of it weak competition that they fell. I don't care how unhealthy they were. If they have a flu bug or a guy's shoulders messed up. You almost lost to Stanford. You almost lost to Arizona State. Those are pathetic teams in the Pac-12. My power rankings showing, and I'm not the only one, showing value to Michigan here. Not very often do I have an overlay of 1.5 or a little bit more than 1.5 on a national championship game. Just doesn't happen. It's usually a half point at most. But because it includes all the data points. But I'm more in the Michigan 6 range here, and I'm not alone with the other power ratings that are out there. In fact, a lot of them have Michigan by more than that here.
A very fair assessment, and kind of where I thought you were going with that, but always helpful to have you articulate it and some of the thought process for a lot of our listeners who have seen Washington up close and personal just in the last 2 data points, not keeping tabs on exactly what this team has done from a full body of work. They've danced between the raindrops. It has paid dividends. They are very worthy of being in the national championship game, a team that was 100-1 to win the title last spring, upwards of 40-1 before the season started. Even Michigan wasn't that well respected in terms of their price, even coming in with substantially higher expectations when you look at the betting market, given the SEC bias that we saw in some of the Georgias and Alabamas. But guys, before we get to Monday night's national champion, there will crown one on Sunday as well in the FCS ranks. Down in Frisco, Texas for the annual FCS championship game at Toyota Stadium, kicking off at 2 o'clock Eastern. It is South Dakota State who will try and defend their national championship as nearly a 2-touchdown favorite against the Montana Grizzlies. The current number on this game, we'll call it 13.5 consensus, Brad. Total on the contest, 49.5. Before we get into a real brief handicap on what to expect between these two teams, can you put in perspective where South Dakota State ranks? I know when people see FCS, they automatically assume that would put a team outside the top 100 or at least outside the Power 5 conferences if we were stacking them up against FBS foes. But this Jackrabbits team feels different. How highly regarded do you have them, and where would they be priced to try and create a little bit more context?
Yeah, if I took their power rating and how I evaluate them and stack them against the FBS, I'd have number 28. So, I mean, that's pretty good. Last I checked, if you throw them in the FBS, they're a top 30 team as far as a power rating goes. And, not all things are created equal in that regard, but I use those power ratings. When the last I checked, the FBS plays the FCS like more than 100 games each year. I use those FCS power ratings to evaluate whether I'm going to bet on or against those teams in those games. So, yeah, I think it's pretty fair. I mean, and if you don't believe me, Jeff Sagarin's been in the BCS formula since 1998. I mean, he stack ranks South Dakota State number 19 in the country if you include FBS. This is an historically great FCS team. I mean, 28 straight wins. Start there. I mean, it's one of the longest winning streaks in the history of FCS football. But it's not like they've ducked anybody. 13 of their last 18 wins have come over ranked FCS teams. They've dominated them. 123-12 is their cumulative score in the playoffs so far. Yards per play margin, basic stat that if you want to dive in just one step further than your basic counting stats. South Dakota State this year is plus 3.2 yards per play. Let's compare that to the great FBS teams of the last decade. I think most people are going to say 2019 LSU with Joe Burrow, 2020 the Alabama team that dominated everybody, even though it was a COVID season. Those teams were less than plus 2.8 yards per play. I got South Dakota State at plus 3.2. So I think that's the major storyline here. Not necessarily that there's great value in the side or the total, but this is one of the best FCS teams of all time, and they deservedly are a double-digit, near 2-touchdown favorite in this game.
What have you seen? Anything from Montana? I know they made a quarterback change in the middle of the year. UNLV fans familiar with Bobby Hawk, who returned home, talking about restoring the legacy. But judging by kind of what you laid out there, number extremely fair in terms of the way it's being priced, with Montana's uptick in performance and South Dakota State's flirtations with historic greatness to try and rival that of what we've seen from one of their biggest rivals in the last handful of years in NDSU.
Yeah, you mentioned it. Montana was not having a good season. They almost lost to a Division II team. I don't mean FCS. I'm talking D2 in Ferris State earlier this year. Then they did get outright upset, and they almost lost to Idaho State. So it was 3 really bad performances in a row. They made a switch up at quarterback, totally changed their season around. They have some good quality wins. I mean, they blew out Montana State. Montana State's a top 5 FCS team. They blew them out. Obviously, they were able to sneak by North Dakota State in the last round at home in overtime. But speaking of that, I mean, this is a team that's probably fortunate to be here. Back-to-back overtime wins and arguably the best home atmosphere at the FCS level. They've really benefited from special teams in the return game. They got a kid by the name of Junior Bergen that has really won them the last 2 games via having kick and punt return touchdowns in those 2 games against North Dakota State and Fuhrman. No relation to you, Todd. But you guys know, we were sitting there watching the Fuhrman-Montana game. You asked me, well, who do you got in this game? I was like, well, I got Fuhrman. And I got a huge power ratings discrepancy, like 7-8 points, even though we're talking about the quarterfinals of the FCS playoffs. And I'm very anti-Montana.
Yep.
And won that bet. So I'm a little surprised when this game gets posted that I go by my power ratings at the FCS. I don't deep dive every game every week. I just basic power ratings. What's it say? It made it 12.5. So when I saw 14.5 on the open, a little bit of bet on Montana, even though I hate them, but because this is a team that I wanted to bet against multiple rounds in a row in the playoffs. So it's just not a high value pick. The more I deep dive it, though, to be perfectly frank, I think South Dakota State is the right side.
Yeah, look, the Jackrabbits will have a chance. They'll be playing in much better and more favorable conditions where I'm sure some of their speed will be on full display than the sub-zero temperatures or at least damn near cold ones that we see a lot of the FCS playoff games take place in, especially with a massive footprint in the Big Sky. Payne, my biggest takeaway there from Brad talking about the atmosphere in Missoula means we have to put that on the bucket list to try and get up there for an FCS game, whether it's Montana against Montana State or somebody else in late November, to really be privy to the elements and exactly what they could create in that small town college atmosphere.
Yeah, on the to-do list, but much further down the list. I will say, and I'm not going to contribute much to this, my guys agreed with Brad there, and they laid some South Dakota State -12 early in that game. So my only contribution to the FCS this podcast.
Hey, look, the other big takeaway I can get from all of this, Brad, I know we have a lot of listeners that are OU and Oklahoma State fans. Oklahoma State may want to consider a little bit of a buyout for their August 31st date when the South Dakota State team will come into Stillwater. May not be a great way for Coach Gundy to start the campaign, since we know SDSU didn't get a chance to play an FBS team, and while the roster will have some turnover, they may relish the opportunity to take on a Power 5 opponent should they go into that game as back-to-back FCS national champions. You can follow.
This is the most actionable advice I could give, and I take it very serious in my FCS stuff. I will be on Oklahoma State in that game.
I like
South Dakota State has like 30 seniors, and all these guys are multiple-year starters. They will be the least experienced team in the FCS next season.
It's time to hit the transfer portal. I hear it's easy to get Florida State guys.
Yeah, it's crazy. We think about these two championship games and the amount of veterans, right? I mean, that's why Washington's here. And that's, I don't want to go back to the Michigan-Washington game, but we talked about some of those injuries. Washington doesn't have a deep team at all. So when their key cogs are banged up, the drop-off is even larger. And you kind of reminded me that in throwing the jab at Florida State. It's like, they probably had 22 guys that could play at this level, but as they were like banged up throughout the course of the year, and then obviously in the bowl game when they all just sat, that's what's interesting and makes that championship game have a ton of variance, because Washington doesn't have a ton of depth, but their first 15 or so guys are really good, and now that they're healthy, could potentially make that game more interesting than we think it could be. I didn't bet the game. I don't have anything on the game. So unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have a best bet for the national championship game like we had in past years. But if we do have something, we'll throw it up on the site before kickoff on Monday.
We'll make sure we get it up there. Brad, is there anything in terms of a lean or anything that you have when you look at some of the diverse markets that are there in the title game?
Not widely available yet. It bothers me that we're doing a national championship and it's not widely priced, but I'm looking more Michigan team total over, because I think there's a couple different pathways. If Washington gets out front, Michigan wants to play catch up. I think they can do that. It was certainly not preferred, but we've seen them playing a back and forth game just in last year's playoff against TCU. And I also think Michigan, if the script does go to plan for them, well, I think they can obviously really lean on Washington, and I wouldn't be a bit surprised. Two different pathways for them to get over 30.5. That'd be my preference. Nothing like, oh, wow, I can't wait to bet it. It's one of my favorite bets of the year type of thing, but a bet that I will be looking to make.
Yeah, Michigan.
Who has the coaching edge here, by the way?
I'm going to say Washington. I know it may not be a popular opinion, and despite the way Kalen DeBoer has managed the clock, I think he gets the edge from a short turnaround standpoint for me. And the other thing that we didn't mention, and you guys can tell me if you think I'm wrong, the one thing I'd be worried about for Michigan that's always tough to quantify, The way that they celebrated winning the Rose Bowl was in stark contrast to Washington. I always wonder about running it back with the level of emotion, the love affair we saw, the hyperbole from Coach Harbaugh about J.J. McCarthy and everything else. It can be tough to replicate that 7 days later, whereas Washington, for me, at least felt like it was much more workmanlike, and the expectation was to get through Texas with bigger fish to fry. I didn't quite get that vibe from Michigan. I'm not saying it's going to play out on the field on Monday night, but it is something to think about that's factored into my handicapping.
I agree with Kalen DeBoer having the coaching edge. I think we could be looking at a guy, forget how his career finished, but it kind of reminds me of Urban Meyer, just wins and wins big immediately. There is no 2-3 year plan to get a program, just comes in there, wins immediately. The win percentage is there, and I know you guys are big trends guys. I'm not, obviously. Obviously, that was tongue in cheek there,
joking.
but yes. I do find it because he's been at multiple stops, and he immediately improved. Whether he's the OC or the head coach, team immediately gets better, and as soon as he leaves, team immediately gets worse than when he was there. As an underdog on DeBoer coach teams since 2016, 27-5 against the spread.
Jesus,
it's pretty good.
Yeah.
Here's a question that we usually don't ask these types of questions. We usually don't talk about this stuff. Monday night, the last game Harbaugh coaches, and then the $1 million follow-up. If you are smart and you just threw all of the coaches in a bucket right now and they're all free agents, are you going after Kalen DeBoer if you're Michigan? We know that's his dream job. Or are you sticking with Sharon Moore?
I'll let Brad field that first. I mean, I know what odds I'll set on Coach Harbaugh making this his final game at Michigan. I'd actually make him a favorite that this is the final game he coaches as a member of the Maize and Blue.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would say 60-40, this is it for him. And it goes higher if he wins the game to go right off in the sunset. So that I certainly think that's the case there. I don't think Michigan goes after DeBoer. I think they just promote from within. But I would think that's a mistake.
Yeah, I would concur. I think they do, and I think it's a mistake. And my instinct says at some point Kalen DeBoer's at Michigan. Knowing that's his dream job behind the scenes, I'm hearing some rumblings there. So, all right.
Hey, well,
how did we go an hour? We went an hour. This is ridiculous.
The one thing I will say, Payne, is if Kalen DeBoer does decide to take another job, Washington will not be bringing Jimmy Lake back to coach for a second stint. That much I'm willing to stake my reputation on. And the fact that
I think all of his run the damn ball merch is still at the Salvation Army.
Hey, look, it may make great holiday gifts to try and share with your loved ones and friends if you want to try and take advantage. But hey, guys, I want to thank both of you for all your hard work that goes into this show each and every week. Brad, I know we started and joked at the top of the show about the preview podcast way back in May. It was the first time we'd ever done G5 previews. I think they were extremely well received because a lot of our listeners know they can't get that caliber of content from people that actually bet the games and move the markets everywhere, especially someone who's watched those spring games from start to finish, knows the rosters and the personnel for Liberty and New Mexico State, as well as he knows the Alabama and Georgias of the world. So having you on board the last 2 seasons has really allowed us to take the Bet the Board college football podcast to levels we probably didn't think were possible a couple of years ago. And I'll go one step further. It's tough to change Payne's mind on a lot of things, Brad, but you've gradually turned him into a college football guy, and that in and of itself is a landmark achievement that I don't think many others will ever be able to put on their professional resume.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Although all it probably took was some shenanigans, which are notorious at the college football level, to probably have him soured, considering what happened to his Florida State team this year.
Well, we'll have to see. There may be a Florida State game in attendance for us on the horizon that we'll have to lay out some of those details. But thanks again, as always, Brad, for all your contributions.
No,
it doesn't matter. We're going to finish this podcast the same way we started the season, Brad. Payne wasn't with us then. He wasn't even on the line. We can ignore anything he wants to add here. He can add that to the NFL show. But best of luck to all of our loyal listeners with whatever investments you choose to make on the final 2 college football games of the season. And like Payne said, if we happen to stumble into a best bet, that'll be posted on the website on Monday when a lot of those markets are more widely available. Thanks to all of you for tuning in each and every week. It is a marathon, not a sprint, that started way back in May, and come Monday night, we will crown a national champion, and hopefully we'll see you at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.